think it's their perspective is super important as well. And there's a couple of stories that I wanted to share, and I feel like their stories should live on. Even despite the horrible atrocities that happened on September 2001, we should be able to celebrate these people 20 years on. So there are a couple stories of people that I wanted to share. And for those of you that don't know, and this is what I was going to discuss earlier, there were 4 flights that crashed on September 11th. So there were the 2 flights, American 11 and United 175, I believe, which crashed into the World Trade Center. Both of those flights were headed for LA. I think 3 of the flights were headed for LA. So, and then the Pentagon flight, American 77, was also headed for LA. But there was one flight that was headed for the Bay Area, for San Francisco, and that was United Flight 93. And United 93 is a unique flight in that it was the one flight that didn't hit its intended target. Why is that? So during the flight, passengers and the flight attendants got basically word and information that flights had been hitting the World Trade Center and eventually the Pentagon, and were basically being warned from the ground up, like there have been hijackings. You guys need to be wary of that. Obviously, they figured out quite early on that their flight was also hijacked, and several members of this flight decided that they were going to do something about it or die trying, literally. And that's exactly what they did. There was a passenger insurgency, so to speak, aided by flight attendants, and they attempted to try to take control of the cockpit. But unfortunately, when they got control, or as they got control of the cockpit, the terrorists crashed the plane into the ground rather than letting them, take control of the plane. So unfortunately, all were killed on board. But I want to mention a couple of the stories from this flight. There's a couple stories from this flight, and then I want to briefly mention someone on American 11. So the first person I would like to mention is a guy by the name of Todd Beamer. Todd Beamer, the reason I want to mention Todd Beamer is that, yes, he grew up in Chicago, and he, big Chicago sports fan. But he also graduated high school from Los Gatos High School, which is, literally 7 minutes from where I live. So he's technically from here. And he was a part of that passenger insurgency. He was, in fact, one of the leaders on Flight 93. He came up with this there's a catchphrase on Flight 93 called "Let's Roll," and that was based on Todd Beamer. That was one of the last things that he said when it came to that. And he was a part of this passenger insurgency that basically potentially stopped this plane from hitting the Capitol building, which could have been very destructive. And that is crazy to think about. And again, like, I was reading his story, and he's just as ordinary a guy as it comes. He had a family, he had a wife, 2 kids that he was raising in New Jersey. I was coming to San Francisco for a business trip, and he was going to take a red eye on the way home so he could spend some more time with the kids. Family man, just a normal human being like one of us. And unfortunately, he was, the victim to this horrible atrocity that took place. And yeah. I think the other story I want to share is this guy by the name of Mark Bingham, who was also one of the leaders of the passenger insurgency on Flight 93. He's actually from Los Gatos. He grew up in the San Jose area, graduated Los Gatos High School in 1988. He was an aspiring filmmaker, and he was coming to the Bay Area because he was going to go to his frat brother's wedding. Speaking of which, he graduated from Cal Berkeley back, I don't know the year, but he graduated from Berkeley. And yeah, he's a South Bay kid. And he was also a normal person. He enjoyed rugby. And he was big into playing rugby. He played rugby for Los Gatos High School. I didn't know they had a rugby team until I started looking into Mark Bingham. And his mom and him had a beautiful bond, which has been portrayed in a documentary, I believe, or in a movie. And his mom, since Mark's death, has been involved with several LGBTQ rights organizations. And Mark was actually, I believe, was part of the LGBTQ community in the 90s, which is something that was looked down upon at that time in history. So that's really cool. And he's actually buried in Saratoga. So again, not too far from my house. Went to high school in Saratoga. at the Madronia Cemetery, which is about a 5-minute drive from the high school. And he was also a part of this passenger revolt, like I mentioned earlier. And then the last name I want to bring up is Betty Ong. She was a flight attendant on American 11. She's not from the South Bay. She's from San Francisco. She grew up in Chinatown. Um, and I was reading about her story today, and her family was basically talking about like the 20-year anniversary of 9/11 and how it was so difficult to move on and all of this stuff. But she is credited for giving uh, basically letting people know that like 9/11 was happening. She was one of the first people to be like, our plane is hijacked, the pilots are stabbed, we don't know where this plane is headed, blah blah blah. And that's what got picked up eventually by the White House and Washington D.C. So she's credited for that. And Betty Ong is also, I believe, a church or a school named after her, which is awesome. And there was a story about her dad who, until his death, basically watched the TV and cried and waited for his daughter to come home safely in the days after the attack. And that's obviously horrible to see that happen, and to hear about that. But of course, there's so many more 9/11 stories. I mean, there's too many to count. I saw one girl who was a student at Santa Clara University who was 20 years old, who was my age when the attack happened. Um, but I wanted to mention Beamer and Bingham in particular because those two were literally, they grew up 5 minutes from where I live, right? 5, 7 minutes from where I live. Um, and I always believe that these names, as well as the other survivors, should never have been forgotten. As these three that I mentioned, Betty, Todd, and Mark, are people who attempted to fight back against these terrorist attacks when literally everything was going wrong. And they were extremely courageous, but unfortunately were victims of this awful, awful attack. So, yeah. But I thought it would be really important, and I think it's an important perspective to share these local stories because it really like humanizes the issue, right? I felt like for 40 minutes I was looking at it from such like a broad view, but like when you just put the microscope on, it's like, wow, like the people that were affected by this are just, they could be human beings like us, like any one of us could have been on that plane. This is the craziest freaking part. Like, how many of us get on planes every day? Obviously, with COVID now, it's less, but before, like pre-pandemic, you would get on a plane and not really expect anything. So it's like blows your mind when you just kind of like think about it and really be like, wow, like that could have literally been any one of us who was going to the East Coast or coming back from the East Coast to come home or whatever it was. So it's just crazy stuff. And the last topic I want to talk about